What happened to Botswana?
Imagine a country that, at the moment it gained independence, had barely 12 kilometers of paved roads and an economy built mainly on cattle herding and foreign aid. That is exactly what Botswana looked like in 1966. It was one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, and at first glance, it had every condition needed to stay poor for decades to come. Yet something completely opposite happened. The country climbed into the group of upper-middle-income nations and became one of the wealthier and most stable states in Africa. To understand that inspiring process, we have to go back to September 1966. On that day, the former British protectorate of Bechuanaland officially gained independence and took the name Republic of Botswana. But gaining independence did not mean that the new government inherited a smoothly functioning state. Quite the opposite. For the British, Bechuanaland was merely a sparsely populated territory that separated their possessions from the influence of rival powers. No great resource deposits had been discovered there were no vast plantations, and no large community of European settlers. That is why London kept the cost of maintaining the protectorate to a minimum. For most of the colonial period, the administration of Bechuanaland was located even beyond the borders of today's Botswana, precisely in Mafeking, on the territory of South Africa. Only shortly before independence was the administrative center moved to the emerging city of Gaborone. The new government, therefore, had to build its own capital and basic infrastructure almost from scratch. Nature did not help either. Around 70% of the country's surface was covered by the Kalahari Desert. Rainfall was irregular, and droughts could lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of cattle. Yet it was cattle herding that formed the foundation of the economy, and beef was one of the country's few export goods. This, however, was not enough to finance the building of a modern nation. For that reason, Botswana still remained dependent on British aid and the infrastructure of its neighbors. The situation in the region was really challenging. To the south, Botswana bordered South Africa, ruled under apartheid. To the east lay Rhodesia, controlled by a white minority, while present-day Namibia remained under South African rule. The young state was therefore poor, militarily weak, and surrounded by more powerful neighbors. Nothing suggested it would avoid the scenario seen in so many other African countries, where independence quickly turned into a struggle for power and the rule of one dictator after another. Surprisingly, things turned out differently here. 45-year-old Seretse Khama became the country's leader, and over time he would go down in history as the architect of Botswana's success. A few months after gaining independence, in March 1967, geologists working for the British company De Beers discovered a huge volcanic structure containing diamonds near Orapa. Unexpectedly, it turned out to be one of the largest deposits of its kind in the world. For a state living mainly off cattle and foreign aid, this was a discovery that could completely transform its future, but it could just as easily have been the beginning of a catastrophe. If seizing power also means control over mines worth billions of dollars, politics quickly becomes a fight for everything. In Angola, diamonds later helped finance a civil war that lasted for decades. In Sierra Leone, control over the deposits became one of the main sources of money for brutal armed groups. Botswana could have gone down a similar path. All the more so because the discovered deposits lay in lands traditionally belonging to the Bangwado people, from whom Seretse Khama himself came. Local chiefs or the president's family could have demanded that most of the money stay in their region. But here, an earlier tradition mattered, one of consulting decisions in the gatherings, along with the conviction that power should not belong to a single person alone. Khama's government therefore chose a completely different solution. On September 29, 1967, the Mineral Rights and Tribal Territories Act came into force. Under it, the rights to the resources lying beneath the ground were transferred to the Republic of Botswana. From that moment on, the deposits were not to belong solely to the tribe or the family on whose land they were found. They were to belong to the entire state. This was one of the most important decisions in the history of Botswana. It prevented a situation in which the richest region would keep all the revenue while the rest of the country fought for a share of the profits. At the same time, the government did not throw out the foreign companies and did not try to take over the mines on its own. Botswana had neither the necessary capital, machinery, and specialists, nor access to the global diamond market. That is why in 1969, it reached an agreement with De Beers and created the De Beers Botswana Mining Company. At the start, the state held 15% of the shares. De Beers brought in money, technology, experience, and access to an international sales network. Mining at the Orapa deposit began in July 1971. Botswanan politics, however, did not treat the initial split as permanent. As more deposits were discovered, its negotiating position grew steadily stronger. In 1975, the state's share was raised from 15 to 50%. De Beers kept the other half. Also in 1992, the company took the name Botswana. A model had emerged in which a foreign partner supplied capital, technology, and expertise, but half of the enterprise belonged to Botswana. As a result, already by the late 1970s, Botswana had access to money it could not even have dreamed of a decade earlier. But a harder question remained. What should be done so that this money did not disappear as quickly as it had appeared? Simply negotiating a favorable share in the mines did not guarantee success for the future generations. Botswana could have received billions from diamonds and then spent them on holding on to power and projects that wouldn't really develop the economy. So, how do you turn money from a non-renewable resource into lasting development for the entire state? To this end, Botswana began using national development plans. These were multi-year documents that set out how much the state could spend and which projects should receive funding. Officials analyzed not only the cost of building a school, a hospital, or a road, but also the cost of maintaining it later. If the state was not able to cover those expenses in the following years, an investment could be postponed. The system was not perfect, but it limited the creation of costly projects that could not be sustained afterward. Diamond revenues were directed above all toward infrastructure and public services. As late as 1980, the centrally maintained network of paved roads was about 1,100 kilometers long. By 2014, it was already nearly 7,000 kilometers. Thanks to these efforts, remote towns gained better access to Gaborone, the mines, schools, hospitals, and markets. A similar change took place in education. In 1977, only 32 secondary schools operated in the entire country. By 2013, their number had grown to 285, and the number of teachers had risen from fewer than 650 to more than 15,000. Healthcare was expanded as well. The number of clinics grew from 16 in 1968 to around 290 in 2012, not counting hundreds of smaller medical points. Money was also spent on water supply and sanitation. According to Statistics Botswana, in 2013, around 97% of the country's inhabitants had access to safe water, including 94% of the rural population. This does not mean that all problems disappeared. Botswana still struggled with droughts, water shortages, and enormous distances between settlements, but the scale of the change was incomparable to the starting point. In the same period the Pula Fund was created, a long-term investment portfolio managed by the Bank of Botswana. It was part of a broader system of reserves meant to hold surpluses from times of good economic conditions. The idea was simple. Every diamond mined meant that less wealth remained underground for future generations. The income from selling it, therefore, had to be turned into other assets: roads, education, healthcare, or long-term savings. The importance of this policy became clear during the global financial crisis. In 2008, Botswana mined about 32.6 million carats of diamonds. A year later, production fell sharply to 17.7 million, almost by half. Thanks to the accumulated reserves, the state could still finance imports and basic expenses without an immediate fire sale of its assets. Not all the money was spent perfectly, of course. Over time, the public sector became very large, and some projects turned out to be costly or badly managed. But the overall principle remained the most important thing. Botswana tried to convert the wealth hidden underground into assets that would remain in the country even after the diamonds were gone. After several decades, the effects of this policy could be seen not only in the balance sheet of the central bank, but above all in the lives of ordinary people. The biggest change is shown by the chart of real GDP per capita. At the moment of independence, nominal income per person stood at just around $70. By 2025, it was nearly $7,800. Between 1965 and 1998, the economy of Botswana grew on average by about 7.7% per year. For more than 3 decades, it was therefore among the fastest growing economies in the world. This does not mean that Botswana became just as rich as Switzerland. It still remains a developing country and faces serious social problems. But like I said earlier, the scale of its rise relative to the starting point was exceptional. Most importantly, the change was not limited to GDP alone. In the early 1990s, around 67% of the country's adults could read and write. By 2014, it was already about 90%. An even greater transformation is shown by the data on poverty. In 1985 and 1986, around 59% of Botswana's inhabitants lived below the national poverty line. In the most recent comparable survey from 2015 and 2016, the figure was already 16.3%. Over 3 decades, the share of the population living in poverty therefore fell by more than 40 percentage points. The expansion of healthcare also produced concrete results. In 1971, out of every 1,000 children born, almost 100 died before their first birthday. 40 years later, that rate had dropped to around 27. The rise in GDP was enormous, but the real change was that people were better educated, and a much smaller part of society remained below the poverty line. So Botswana stopped being seen only as a poor country dependent on foreign aid. It became one of the most stable and credible states in Africa. And just in general, Botswana can now actually be seen as a state that offers investors predictability. A company building a mine or a factory may need to wait more than a decade for its investment to pay off. It therefore needs certainty that the state will not suddenly seize its assets or revoke its license. Botswana built a reputation as a country where such risk was relatively small. Protection of property was written into the constitution, and seizing private assets required a legal basis and proper compensation. Reports on the investment climate confirmed that these rights were actually enforced. The second element was the administration. Naturally, Botswana's bureaucracy did not always work quickly, but it remained relatively professional. Officials more often earned their positions through qualifications than through tribal affiliation or party loyalty. For investors, this meant that officials' decisions should not be overturned overnight after a minister was replaced. A relatively simple tax policy also mattered. For years, the standard income tax for local businesses was 22%, and the top personal income tax rate was 25%. These were not the lowest taxes in the world, but they allowed companies to calculate their operating costs in advance. Similar predictability was maintained in monetary policy. In 1976, Botswana introduced its own currency, the pula. Its exchange rate was later linked to a basket of the country's most important trading currencies and regularly adjusted according to set rules. This made it possible to limit sudden devaluations as well as excessive strengthening of the currency caused by the inflow of diamond money. Another advantage was political stability. Since independence, Botswana has regularly held elections and has never experienced a military coup. An investor did not have to assume that in a few years the army would seize power and void earlier agreements. For most of that period, the state also kept low debt and large foreign currency reserves. As a result, it did not have to rescue its budget by printing money or suddenly raising taxes. Botswana's relatively low level of corruption may be the best example of how the country's institutions function. In the Corruption Perceptions Index for 2025, Botswana received 58 points out of 100 and ranked 41st out of 182 countries. The average for sub-Saharan Africa was only 32 points. In Africa, only Seychelles and Cape Verde scored better, with Botswana tied for third place with Rwanda. This does not mean the country is completely free of corruption, but compared to the region, Botswana looks much more appealing for investors. Another example of Botswana simply functioning well as a country occurred in 2024 during the election. The ruling BDP party, which had held power for an impressive 58 years, accepted an election defeat and peacefully handed over power. The economic test, however, may prove far harder. For decades, diamonds financed roads, hospitals, schools, and state reserves. Despite efforts to prevent it, they created a dependence that Botswana never fully escaped. They still account for about 70 to 80% of export revenue and close to 1/3 of state income. That did hurt the economy after the pandemic. Since global demand for natural stones weakened noticeably, sales fell especially in China, and cheaper diamonds produced in laboratories became a growing competitor. For Botswana's budget, the consequences were enormous. Botswana cut production, state revenues fell, and real GDP shrank by 2.8% in 2024. According to World Bank estimates, in 2025, the economy contracted by a further 0.9%. These were 2 years of decline in a country that had earlier been among the fastest growing in the world. The crisis also hit public finances. Public debt rose from 22.5% of GDP in 2023 to around 39.5% in March 2026, representing a nearly twofold increase. An even bigger problem remains the labor market. In the first quarter of 2024, unemployment stood at 27.6%, and among young people, it reached as high as 38.2%. Botswana built a pretty good education system, but it did not build an economy large enough to employ all its graduates. Social inequality also remains high. The most recent comparable measurement by the World Bank put the Gini coefficient at 53.3 points, one of the highest figures in the world. The heart of the problem, however, is not merely dependence on diamonds. Botswana did not create a large enough private sector outside of mining. The state still remains an important employer and the owner of many enterprises, which drastically limits competition. The diamond industry itself brings enormous revenue, but creates relatively few jobs. That is why Botswana needs sectors that will both earn money and employ people. The new government is undertaking the Botswana Economic Transformation Program, aimed at increasing the role of private investment and service exports. One direction is premium tourism. The Okavango Delta and Chobe National Park make it possible to attract wealthy tourists without developing mass tourism. A second is finance and digital technology. Botswana wants to use its political stability and its location in southern Africa to turn Gaborone into a regional services hub. Another opportunity is solar energy. A large land area and high levels of sunshine could help reduce energy imports and in the future allow the country to sell energy to its neighbors. The state also wants to develop diamond cutting, jewelry manufacturing, and the mining of copper and other minerals. Simply replacing one resource with several others, however, will not be true diversification. That will come only when private services, technology, processing, and regional trade also develop. Currently, there is no single reliable date for the depletion of the deposits. However, the greatest threat at present is not a lack of stones underground. It is the risk the customers will stop paying as much for them as they used to, due to the growing popularity of synthetic diamonds. Despite these uncertainties, the World Bank forecasts that in 2026, the economy could grow by about 2.7%, but the rebound is expected to come above all from a partial recovery in diamond sales. If the return of growth still depends mainly on a single resource, then the old model has not yet been replaced. Botswana is not a country without problems, but that does not change the scale of the success of a country that started with 12 kilometers of paved roads and then became one of the most stable and wealthiest states in Africa. Not every country, however, was so fortunate with its leaders. A good example here is Argentina, which was once among the richest countries in the world, but whose successive governments squandered its potential and drove it into repeated bankruptcies. And you can learn more about how Argentina's economic collapse came about from the video now appearing on your screen.